Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Okay, I'm just gonna turn off the music and test one more time, see how it is. Okay, I'm just gonna turn off the music and test one more time, see how it is.
Due to unusual rain and thunder, baby, I wonder, would you just put your sweats on for me? Yeah, 'cause I got the plug, I made the coffee green. I'm talking late night for ya. Let me lay a great time on ya. Don't hesitate, no, don't you? No. Just say you will. Come through and chill. Just say you will. Come through and chill. I wanna all night. Say it. I wanna all night. I wanna all night. Say it. I wanna all night. Hello, stranger. Babe's been waiting. Just as I recall, that ass is still amazing. Playing, baby. No, I'm saying, baby. You love it, shit. You know I'm crazy. So go ahead and put a drink up.
That's what love we got to drink up.
Get to taking that off me. Yeah. 'Cause I got the plug, I made the coffee green. I'm talking late night for ya. Let me lay a great time on ya. Don't make me wait, no, don't you? No. Just say you will. Come through and chill. Just say you will.
Shit, that's a good song.
Come through and chill.
Hey, Gooch, can I tell us some real shit? Yeah. In case my lack of reply had you catching them feelings. Know you been on my mind like Kaepernick kneeling, or police killings, or Trump saying slick shit, manipulating poor white folks because they ignorant, blind to the struggles of the ones that got the pigment. Lately I've been stressing cause it seems so malignant. I need to feel your essence in my presence. If you with it, I guarantee you won't regret you did it. Come
Come through and chill. Just say you will. Come through and chill. Just say you will. Come through and chill. Just say you will. Come through and chill. I wanna all night. Say it. I wanna all night. I wanna all night. Say it. I wanna all night.
Pick up the phone, show me if it's real. Pick up the phone, show me if it's real. Pick up the phone, show me if it's real. Pick up the phone. Yeah.
We're gonna start the review in a second, boys. Just give me a second.
Whatever goes around eventually comes back to you. So you gotta be careful, baby, and look both ways before you cross my mind.
just check my story. See ya, see ya.
But you just can't give up now, 'cause you gotta save yourself.
Yeah, I gotta hang on, baby.
The sun will come out. Nothing good ever comes easy. I know times are rough, but winners don't quit, so don't you give up. The sun will come out. Though we've been struggling endlessly, someday we'll find the love. 'Cause after the storms, when the flowers bloom.
What up, cuz? I'm back. Welcome, welcome. Let's see. We're gonna start in probably maybe like 2 more minutes. I don't know. Let's wait for a couple more people to come in. Let's wait for a couple more people. You know, to the one person in here, how was your day? How was your day? Is the music too loud? Is the music too loud? What's happening? Who's the one guy in here right now? Or girl? I want to know who you are. I want to know who I'm talking to. I dream about your face. Let me see. All right, I'm gonna guess by looking at the people that have seen my post. I'm gonna say James. James, is that you? This is Winnie the Pooh, by the way. It's really messy back there, so then I had to put this up to cover up the mess. Alright. I think I'm just gonna start. I think I'm gonna go ahead and start. So we're gonna start off. Did you guys want to go with the music? Should we do it with the music or without the music? Can someone comment? I don't know. Should we do it with the music? Well, thank you for the input, guys, but I'm gonna do it with music. Alright, so we're gonna start with the Respiratory track. Okay. So this is just a chart that shows Earth's atmosphere, just so we kind of know what we're breathing in. You'll explore more what happens to the nitrogen that you actually breathe in later. But as for now, you don't really need to worry about what happens to nitrogen. You just need to worry about oxygen and the other gases. But other gases aren't really relevant, because oxygen right here is all you need for cellular respiration. So breathing is the movement of air from the environment into the body. So the environment being the atmosphere, or it could even be the room you're in. So let's look at respiration and breathing. So respiration involves the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between cells in the environment. So it's a really big misconception that, oh, whack. Alright, so this copyrighted audio on my stream. So, okay. Alright, so let's just do it without music then, I guess. Okay, so respiration involves the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between cells and the environment. So it's not just breathing, it's not just taking in oxygen, because there's going to be questions like on the test like, oh, what is respiration, or what is breathing? And people are going to say, oh, it's one of the options are going to be, oh, it's taking in oxygen, or it's inhaling. But what it actually is, it's the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the cells and the environment. So respiration and breathing. External respiration is actually just the exchange of gases between the lungs and the circulatory system. So that would be right when you breathe the air in, it's inside your lungs now, and then from your lungs it diffuses into your blood cells, and that would be external respiration. Internal respiration would be, so once it's finished external, it's now inside your capillaries, inside your veins, and it's going to travel into your muscles. And so once the blood is inside your veins, it's going to diffuse into your muscles, and that's what internal respiration would be. So there's actually two kind of steps to respiration. The first step would be external, which would be from you breathe it into your lungs, and then from the lungs and the alveoli right here, from the lungs and alveoli, it will go into your capillaries or your veins or into your blood. And then from your blood, this is internal respiration, is when it goes from your blood into your muscle tissues. Ugh. And so here are the order of events for respiration. You would go from breathing to external respiration to internal and cellular respiration. So you don't really need to worry about cellular respiration. We've kind of gone over this already, so it's not really that big of a deal. So don't worry about that. But you got to remember that external is actually from your lungs. So I'm going to draw your two little sacs here. These are your lungs. From your lungs into your blood vessels. That's your little blood there. And then internal would be from your little, here, I'll make it red just for accuracy. So from your blood cells, it's going to go into your big muscles. So this is like a bicep right here. This is a bicep. And the low oxygens are just going to go O2 into your muscles. And that would be internal respiration when it goes from your lungs, when it goes from your blood into your muscles. So just remember that. Don't get those mixed up. And that should be it. Can I close this? Can I go down, please? Just no. Okay. What's happening? Okay. Well, not doing that again. Alright, so adaptations for gas exchange. So in small aquatic organisms, gases diffuse directly between the environment and all the body cells. So sometimes like fishes with their gills and stuff like that, the gases will actually diffuse straight from the water into their body. But for us, it's a lot more things that are going on. So for more complex organisms, a special respiratory system is required. So because everyone kind of breathes differently, but except like mammals all breathe pretty similar. Anyways, yeah. must have thin walls and must be kept moist. So the reason you want thin walls when you're actually inhaling or for the diffusion of oxygen is so the oxygen can more easily diffuse, because you have to remember that breathing is actually the diffusion of oxygen from one area to another area, and that would be the exchange of gases, and that's what breathing actually is. It isn't just taking in oxygen, and you have to remember that. That's actually a key component. They're going to ask that a lot on the unit test. So it must be kept moist because we need everything to be flowing properly. Much like lungs, when they expand, we're going to go into that later. But when lungs expand, they need to be able to have the moisture and the elasticity to shrivel up again. And so must be richly supplied with blood vessels, we know that, and must have large surface area. And so you don't really need large surface area, but large earth surface area is actually really important for just maximum diffusion of oxygen. And so here we'll see a diagram of the pharynx right here, and let's go down the epiglottis. And the epiglottis we'll explore later, but it's essentially a trap door that that's what Miss Martin calls it. It's a trap door, and it just prevents food from going into your lungs. So you guys can, I don't know, take a picture of this, look on D2L, up to you. And these are the alveoli. And these alveoli, they're actually only one cell thin, so they're really, really small, and they're really, really effective at absorbing that oxygen. And so the structures that you'll need to know are the upper airway, which is the nasal passage, the pharynx. So nasal passage is essentially like the nose. I don't need to really do this. Just go up right here. So this would be like the nasal cavity, the nose. And then the pharynx would be like kind of like the back of your throat, right back here. And then the larynx is like your voice box. Your voice box is the cords that vibrate and allow you to speak. So that's where the larynx would be, down here. And without a larynx, you wouldn't be able to talk. And then the epiglottis, which I explored a little bit earlier, and it's essentially just like kind of a trapdoor that opens and closes depending on if you're eating or not, and it stops food from getting into your lungs. And so that was everything up here. So that would be called the upper airway, or the upper respiratory system, as some people will call it. And the lower airway is actually down here, and so that's where the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveoli, the diaphragm, rib muscles, and pleural membrane are. And don't panic, that's a lot of words that you've probably heard before if you're watching the stream, but it is a lot of words. And the trachea, we'll go into it later, but basically the trachea is for your air to go into your lungs. The bronchi are actually, it's these little tubes that lead into your lungs, and they're lined with mucus and cilia and like kind of like hairy stuff, and basically it covers pathogens and foreign particles and stuff like that, and then allows you to kind of cough it out and spit it out, because without these you'd be sucking in all sorts of bad stuff. So, and then that's good. Oh, you didn't need to hear that. And then the alveoli, which we explained earlier, are like these little things down here, and they will actually allow for the exchange between carbon dioxide and oxygen. And we will also get into that a little later, because this is actually going to take a while. This is probably going to take an hour and a half, or maybe even 2 hours, I don't know. But and the diaphragm, which is next, is you'll see some pictures of it later. Oh, right here. And it is this kind of like condom looking thing, and it will expand, it will contract, and it will relax according to your breathing. And maybe we'll watch a video later on how the diaphragm works. But anyways, we'll look at all these in more detail in a second. So where is the respiratory tract located? It is deep in the body. It is protected by muscular and bone structure called the thoracic cavity. This means chest plate. So this thoracic cavity would be like along here, like the sternum and the ribs and stuff like that all protect this, because it's pretty delicate that what goes on underneath here, and it needs to be protected by all that bone and muscle. And so the upper respiratory tract is just the nasal cavity, the pharynx, and larynx, like we talked about earlier. Some diagrams, the epiglottis will also be on there. But this is really simplified. Like you can see, this doesn't really involve the alveoli or any of that here. The tracheae, the primary bronchi, and the lungs. And so the bronchi are these two lines right here. that connect into the lungs. And then these smaller lines you'll see there, these are called the bronchioles, and that is where the alveoli are attached to. It's around the bronchioles. And so air enters the body through, we already know this, we breathe in through either our nose or our mouth. So the nasal passage is, pair of nostrils. We already know that. And this is here to actually moisten and filter the air. That's what our nostrils are for. The hair helps filter out pathogens and all that type of stuff. And it contains cilia and mucus. So when you do that weird, like to spit out your mucus, that's where it's all coming from. It's from your nasal passage. And your pharynx, aka your throat, is a passageway for air in the respiratory system and food for the digestive system. If that went through your head, it's just where all the stuff comes in. It's where all the air comes in, where all the food comes in for the digestive system. And it branches at the back of the throat into the trachea and into the esophagus. This is blocked out here, but esophagus is basically where your food goes. A good way to remember is in that one Kanye song. Kanye talks about how he bruises Amber Rose's esophagus, and by esophagus, because Amber Rose was like, and bruised her esophagus because she was eating, so bruised her esophagus. Esophagus is for eating, and that's a good way to remember it. And I'll show you the song later, so you can remember. And anyways, the epiglottis is a cartilage flap. It's really it's most commonly referred to as a trapdoor. You're gonna see it called a trapdoor basically on every scientific article you read. It lies behind the tongue and in front of the larynx, so you can almost kind of feel it when you're chewing your food, and your food most commonly hits the back of your trachea. So that's a really good way to kind of remember, because your epiglottis just stops the food from going into your trachea. It closes over the opening to the trachea when a person swallows food, so that doesn't enter the trachea. Yeah, that's basically it. Oh, sorry. So the larynx, aka the voice box, is cartilage, and it contains vocal cords. So breathing equals a large gap between the vocal cords, and talking is when the muscles contract and vocal cords move closer together and they vibrate to make a sound. So we basically have guitar strings, lots of guitar strings inside our voice, and we manipulate them with the muscles in our larynx to make a sound. And that's really all you need to know about the larynx. You'll go here and you'll see that longer chords have a lower sound and shorter chords have a higher sound. And that's about it. Inflammation of the cords means a lower frequency of vibrations. Think of it like a bass guitar, where if it's thicker, then it's gonna be lower, and that's why every time you have a cold, your throat it's sore because it's inflamed, and if it's inflamed, that means your vocal cords are thicker, and so thicker is like a bass guitar, so it's gonna sound lower. So it's just another picture of the respiratory tract. Super simple. So the trachea, aka the windpipe, contains mucus-producing cells, and it traps particles not trapped by the nasal passage. So this is for people that breathe with their mouth. They're going to use the cilia and the mucus inside their trachea a lot more than people that would breathe through their nose. So your trachea is surrounded by cartilage, semicircular discs of cartilage, and it needs to be surrounded by cartilage so that the trachea never gets all flimsy and folds over itself, or so it never collapses, because if it collapses, then you can't breathe. So that's really important. That's going to be a question on the unit test, 100%. It's going to ask about the cartilage inside the trachea, and you're going to have to remember that. And so here's the esophagus. We talked about the esophagus earlier. You eat with the esophagus. Not relevant, though, to the trachea. And this is the larynx right there. And then that is the trachea, the little windpipe that comes down and branches into the bronchi. Nice. So now we're going to talk about the bronchi, actually. So the trachea branches into two smaller passageways right here, and these are the bronchi, and a singular passageway is called the bronchus. enter left and right lungs lined with cilia and mucus producing cells. So you'll see that a lot of the linings down here, like the trachea, the bronchi, and even the nostrils in the nasal passageway, they're lined with a lot of cilia and mucus producing cells, and thus ensure we're not breathing in any random foreign particles like dust or dirt or any of that stuff that might harm or inflame our respiratory system. And so the bronchi subdivide into smaller branches called the bronchioles. And so you can see in this picture here, or there's a better picture here, these right here are the bronchi, the two right here are bronchi, bronchi for two, and then down here are the bronchioles. Right there, those little blue lines are the bronchioles. And so these bronchioles are smooth muscle. They lack cartilage, so they're really flimsy and flexible, because they need to be, because the lung is constantly expanding and contracting. So they need to be smooth and made out of muscle, so they can adapt to the movement. And so they're also lined with cilia and mucus producing cells. So there's a lot of protection here to the respiratory tract against foreign particles and dust. A lot of it. There's essentially mucus and cilia producing cells in every passageway that leads down into the lungs. So that's a good way to remember it. It's kind of hard to forget if it's kind of just everywhere. And so here are the bronchi, or the bronchus would be this one. It's called bronchi here. I'm not sure why, but it should be called the bronchus. And then it branches out into the bronchiole. And then at the end of all these bronchioles are the alveoli, which is up next. So each bronchiole ends in a tiny cluster of sacs called alveoli. And these alveoli here, even though they look pretty big, they're actually only one cell wall thick. And so that's makes it so it's pretty easy to exchange gases between. Very little distance for the oxygen molecules to diffuse. And so, yeah, each lung contains about 15 million alveoli. They are one cell thick for easy gas diffusion, and they're surrounded by capillaries that are also one cell thick, and they're lined with lubricating film, and they are the site of gas exchange. And so the alveoli are actually crucial. You'll talk a lot more about how it works and how oxygen diffuses in and out of the alveoli later, or soon, pretty soon actually. And so the alveoli, it's within alveoli, there is a diffusion of gases. O2 that is breathed in moves from within the alveoli to the capillaries. And if you guys don't remember, that is called external respiration, is from when the gas moves from your alveoli into your capillaries. And then while this is happening, CO2 from the capillaries are also diffusing into the alveoli to be breathed out. We're going to learn more about this during partial pressures, and we're going to see why O2 is going into the capillaries and why CO2 is coming out. But essentially, this right here is the blood flow. Boom, 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 boom. Don't need to spend much time looking at this because this is actually ridiculously confusing to look at. We'll simplify it later. So alveoli during exhalation. Exhalation, if you don't know what it is, it's just breathing out, letting out all that SO2. Alveoli collapse, and so they kind of shrink, and that's why, if you look up here, it says that they're lined with a lubricating film, and that is to keep the alveoli nice and elastic, so it can constantly expand and contract. And so when you're exhaling, the alveoli collapse, and the membranes touch together, and they don't stick together because of film and a protein called lipoprotein, which is down here. If you look at it, it's called surfactant. There won't be any questions about that on the test, but just a cool fact, that is what it looks like, the lubricant or the lipoproteins. And during inhalation, the alveoli, they reopen, and some babies don't produce enough lipoprotein and have trouble opening their alveoli upon inhalation. You don't really need to know that. That's just a cool fact, and another easy way to remember the alveoli are like lungs, and they expand and contract and expand and contract to release or let out oxygen or CO2. Yes, and the pleural membrane. This will be the last thing we talk about, and then we're going to take a little, 1-minute break. But, so the pleural membrane surrounds the outer surface of the lungs, so it's like a protective film, kind of, around the lungs, and it keeps it moist. And so the space between the pleural membrane is actually filled with this like type of liquid. I think it's a protein. Don't quote me on that, but it just basically keeps your lungs nice and smooth so they can expand properly inside your chest cavity. And yes, so that is the respiratory system. Well, not the respiratory system, but that is a basic overview. So I'm gonna turn on some music now. Then we're gonna chill for a bit. There's no comments here. I feel kind of lonely. Where are you guys? And the reason I take occasional like 5 or 4 minute breaks is to ensure that you guys are able to absorb the information. I'm also able to absorb the information because I don't know if you guys know this or not, but the brain actually works in 30-second bursts. So it's always good to take a break. What up, everybody? Weird side note, but I've been really obsessed with these snack bars lately. They're the Kashi. Here, let me frame properly. They're the Kashi. This is French. Kashi dark mocha almond. They're so good. They are so good. I can't think of a single granola bar I've had that beats these. All right. Anyways, now we're gonna look at breathing movements. Yeah, breathing movements. Once I take my last bite out of this. All right. So, in breathing movements, we're gonna discuss the pressure difference between the atmosphere and the chest cavity, which determines the movement of air. Because if you guys learned in grade 10 science or like chemistry or anything, we know that the law of diffusion, which is gases or particles even always move from an area of high concentration down to low concentration, and that it's the same principle for gases moving from high to low pressure. So the reason it is so easy for us to inhale is because the pressure, the partial pressure of oxygen and the concentration of oxygen in the air is so much higher than the amount in our lungs that we're almost forced to breathe in air. And so gases move from high to low pressure. So inhalation occurs when the pressure in the lungs is lower than that of the atmospheric pressure. This is pretty much always unless you breathe in really hard and then you can feel a lot of pressure in your lungs. And in this case, the atmospheric pressure is lower and you're almost inclined to release your air if you wanted to look like an idiot like me and try that. And exhalation occurs when the pressure in the lungs is higher than the atmospheric pressure. Oh, hi Jessica. Occurs when pressure in the lungs is higher than the atmospheric pressure. And again, that is because the law of diffusion. And earlier we were talking about the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is right down here, is the dome-shaped muscle that separates organs from the thorax and the abdomen, and it regulates the pressure in the lungs with assistance from the intercostal muscles. And so these muscles right here, I'm not sure if you can actually, yes, they did fill that out for you. So there are muscles right here in between these ribs, and these are called the intercostal muscles. And these actually, when they contract, they enlarge in your rib cage, and it opens up more space for your lungs to inhale. And every time you inhale, the muscles will contract, and it will allow for more space for your lungs to expand. And then when you breathe out, the muscles relax and your rib cage goes back into its original state, and that will kind of let your lungs shrink down. And you guys also have to remember, so many things to remember, that when you breathe in with your diaphragm is actually moving down to kind of make a smiley face. So think about it that way. When you're breathing in, you're happy. Your whole body is happy that you're breathing in because there's so much diffusion of oxygen and you're able to breathe. And so your diaphragm goes like this because it's happy when you breathe in. And then when you breathe out and exhale, your diaphragm becomes sad and it goes up like this. And because you're sad, you're out of air and you might die from carbon dioxide poisoning. But then you breathe in again, whoop, and then you're happy. And that is basically the movement of the diaphragm. So during inhalation, this is what I was just talking about. Diaphragm contracts, pulling downwards, and you are happy when it contracts because you are breathing in, and then the intercostal muscles contract, which make the ribs bigger. And so your lungs can actually expand because of this, because intercostal muscles are helping your lungs expand and allowing the space for it to do so. And so when you're inhaling, the volume of your chest increases, and the pressure in your lungs decreases, and air rushes in while this is happening. So rib cage expands as rib muscles contract. So it might seem kind of counterintuitive. Oh, sorry, Alex. Why are you streaming on YouTube? I'm streaming on YouTube because it's a lot easier for people to just jump on YouTube than it is for Twitch. They have to like download Twitch if they're watching on their phone or something. It's just a lot easier on YouTube. Okay, so back to it. Rib cage expands as muscles contract. And it might seem counterintuitive that your muscles are contracting, but the rib cage is expanding. But just remember it that way, that it's ironic in the sense that your rib muscles are contracting, but your ribs are actually getting bigger to allow for more space. And this is inhalation. And during exhalation, your rib cage gets smaller as your ribs relax. Again, they return to their original state, and your lungs also decrease in volume. So during exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes, pulling upwards and making that little smiley face, that little frowny face, and the intercostal muscles relax and the rib cage falls down to its original position. And when this happens, your chest volume decreases, the pressure in your lungs increases, and air is forced out. And it may seem weird that I can't dance game? I don't know what you're talking about, Richie. Anyways, so it might seem weird that your pressure is actually increasing during exhalation because, if you think about it, there's actually less air, and so there's less kind of pressure, less things to move around inside your lungs. But think of it more like a vacuum, or when you vacuum seal a plastic bag, you're actually exhaling, you're forcing all the air out of the bag, and there's a really high pressure in that bag. It's sucking on everything inside that bag when you vacuum seal something, right? So think of it that way. When you're exhaling, it's like a vacuum seal that is sucking your air out, and when you're inhaling, it's like you're blowing into the bag, and the pressure is really low. So rib cage expands as rib muscles contract. We were just looking over this, so no need to go over it again. But if you guys have any questions, put them in the comments. I will answer your question.
The mechanics of breathing involve changing the volume and pressure of the thoracic cavity. By using the principles of Boyle's law, one can see that the pressure in the thoracic cavity is inversely proportional to its volume. When the intercostal muscles contract, the ribs are elevated. At the same time, the diaphragm contracts. These events expand the thoracic cavity, decreasing its internal pressure. The lungs expand, filling the thoracic cavity. The resulting pressure in the lungs is lower than that outside the body. Air enters the lungs until equilibrium is reached. When the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles relax, the thoracic cavity recoils. The resulting increase in pressure causes the air within the lungs to be expelled.
And that is everything I told you, but in a more confusing way. So, if my way works better, then I'm glad I helped. What does thoracic mean? I'm not sure what thoracic means, but the thoracic cavity is actually just everything that encases your respiratory system. Thoracic is basically everything that protects your respiratory system. So your thoracic cavity would involve your ribs, it would be your sternum, it would be the muscles around your throat, and that would be kind of like the general like categorization of what thoracic would mean. Chest plate. Yeah, your chest plate is your ribs and your sternum, but thoracic is an umbrella term to kind of categorize everything that protects your respiratory system. And so disorders of the respiratory system. You don't really need to know that much about this. A lot of these are just different ways to remember the kind of organs and things going on inside your respiratory system. But a lot of these questions are actually on the unit test, so we're going to have to go over them anyways, even though they're not really relevant to how the respiratory system works. But that's fine. Laryngitis is inflammation of the larynx due to viral infection or overstraining your voice. And so the vocal cords become so inflamed they can no longer vibrate together, and your voice becomes hoarse, or you lose it altogether temporarily. In severe cases, people may actually tear their vocal cords and they can't talk. But that is really, really extreme. And yeah, just remember that inflammation of your vocal cords is kind of like a bass, and a bass is really thick, and so it's lower. And so yes, this is normally what your larynx is like, with your little vocal cords like on the side right here. And then this is what it's like when it's inflamed. Now this picture is a little funny looking, so I'm just gonna, alright. Pneumonia. Pneumonia is a disease that occurs when the alveoli in the lungs become inflamed and fill with liquids. This interferes with gas exchange, obviously, because since the liquids is covering a lot of the tissue, it actually prevents the diffusion of gases like to go from the capillaries to the alveoli and stuff. And so this is a bacterial disease, and there's just two main types of pneumonia. There's lobular pneumonia and bronchial pneumonia. And bronchial is actually happens like along the ends of your bronchioles, like that, like the picture says. And lobular is just, that's messed up. That's messed up. You should get that checked out if you have that. Bronchitis is a disorder that causes the bronchi to become inflamed and fill with mucus, which is expelled by coughing. And so that's why you might notice this is a common symptom of even having a cold, because when you have a cold, your bronchi do become inflamed, and then you start coughing, and the coughing actually inflames a lot of other things inside of your body. And so That's a good way to remember what bronchitis is if you know what a cold is. And so excess production of mucus, there's tissue swelling, there's narrowing of the air passage, and there's decreased air movement through the bronchi in general. So bronchitis really affects your breathing because it's thinning the passageways inside your lungs, and so less air can actually travel through. And there's also more mucus that you have to kind of cough out. So you spend less time breathing in, more time coughing out. And yes, this is what your airways look like when you have bronchitis. And these are actually white blood cells, I believe, to fight the infection. And this is what it should look like. So if you guys ever take a peek at your bronchioles and they look like that, you should go to the doctor. So emphysema is an obstructive respiratory disorder in which the walls of the alveoli break down and lose their elasticity. And so exhalation becomes difficult because you guys have to remember, alveoli are like lungs, and when you exhale, they actually compress like that. And then that makes it really difficult to breathe when there's no more elasticity because they can't expand and compress the same way they usually do. And this is commonly caused by smoking. This is also really common when you get older because you lose your collagen in your skin and it just gets really hard to breathe. And so this is what your alveoli look like with emphysema, and this is what they look like normally. I would assume this is also why your lungs are black when you smoke a lot. Yes, very nice. So asthma is, we all know what asthma is. For what we know it as is, it's just, oh, you cough a lot and you can't run. But scientifically, people with asthma are people that have constant inflammation in their airways, and so their airways are smaller, and it makes it harder for them to breathe. And they're sensitive to pollen, dust, smoke, anything that's not really air, like nitrogen or oxygen, and too much of these foreign particles, can actually cause an asthma attack. And that is when your bronchioles swell, the muscles tighten, and mucus production increases. And so there's a lot more things that are blocking your airways that usually are not there. And cystic fibrosis is a serious genetic condition that affects the lungs caused by an abnormal gene that disrupts the function of the cells. And so this causes thin mucus and liquid coating on the insides of the lungs to become very thick and sticky. And you guys just remember that anything that's thick, anything that's sticky, anything that traps foreign particles, or anything that makes the airway smaller and harder to expand and contract is really bad, and that just makes it harder to breathe. So a common symptom of basically every one of these conditions is just, it makes it a lot harder to breathe. And so when you have cystic fibrosis, mucus is so thick that it traps pathogens that cannot be expelled because it's just so deep inside your respiratory system. And cancer. I didn't expect it to get this deep, but lung cancer is uncontrolled and it's invasive growth of abnormal cells in the lungs. A cool fact about cancer, everybody has the cells that are capable of mutating and turning into cancer cells, so no one's actually really safe from cancer. Anyways, yeah, so abnormal cells, they multiply and form a malignant tumors or carcinomas, and those are basically carcinomas and tumors. They're essentially weird growths or bumps or cysts and random stuff that are inside your tissue. And carcinogens are basically cancer-causing agents, like smoke, not even tobacco smoke. It can be like carbon, I think monoxide, can also give you cancer. And this is what it makes your lungs look like. And so the boring section of this entire unit is over. This is probably the most boring and pointless. So let's move on and look at some more fun stuff. So now we're talking about gas exchange and transport. And we're going to look at this cool video of the diaphragm that I really wanted to show you guys earlier. Yeah, let's just take a look.
The Cadbury bunnies are back, but only until Easter.
Okay, not this part here.
It's always busy at the Cadbury Egg Farm.
Ready to see some amazing experiments?
It is
We're going to show you how your incredible body works.
this
For a
part.
very important scientific demonstration.
Okay, well, I suppose if it's in the service of science.
Good. And this at the bottom is your diaphragm. Now,
It's really
we
laggy. I don't
tend
know
to
why.
think that breathing is all about the lungs, but the diaphragm is the unsung hero of breathing.
Okay, hold on. I'm sorry, guys. Okay.
It's what makes it all happen, and that's why the diaphragm is such an important muscle.
Now, when you breathe in, the diaphragm pulls downwards.
Like that.
This
Makes a
lowers the
smiley
pressure
face.
Inside
The
this
diaphragm
chest
makes a
cavity.
smiley face.
This creates extra space, a vacuum, and air has no option but to rush in through your mouth and into your lungs to fill this space.
And then you breathe out again. Your lungs really are a bit like these balloons. They have no muscles at all. They're just like bags, really, and they don't do anything without the diaphragm.
And that is how you breathe. And so a lot of us will think that breathing is like, oh, your lungs get bigger and air comes in, but your lungs actually aren't even doing anything. They're kind of just hanging there inside your upper respiratory system. And then when you breathe, or your lower respiratory system, sorry, and when you breathe, the diaphragm pulls down and it forces air into the lungs. And so your lungs actually aren't the Legend of Tommy. Oh, I'm just reviewing some biology for everyone. And so your lungs aren't actually doing anything special. All they're doing is expanding, and they're getting smaller because your diaphragm is forcing air into your lungs. So think about that when you're breathing. You're not actually breathing because your lungs want to breathe. You're breathing because your diaphragm is forcing your lungs to breathe. And that is pretty cool. And pneumothorax it's not a condition. It's a scenario in which there's actually your lung collapses and air leaks into the space between your lung and chest wall. And so since there is space here between your lung and your chest wall right here, your lung essentially collapses and it can't really breathe, and you can't breathe out of that lung. And so for this period of time, you're actually only breathing with one lung. And while a lot of our organs inside our body, like our kidney or our liver and stuff like that, are functional with a handicap, our lungs aren't. And with just one lung missing, it makes oxygen diffusion a lot harder for our body. And so the air pushes on the outside of your lungs and makes it collapse. And to solve this, you'll see this in movies a lot. They'll basically jam a needle into your chest or your rib cage, into your chest cavity, and this will fill up the air inside your lungs, and it will equalize the pressure between your lungs and the atmosphere. And that is why they do that. Yeah, just like that. Oh, my mom's being really loud. Anyways, and so the partial pressure of oxygen, this would be it. You don't really have to remember this, so I'm just gonna skip by it. We don't really need to talk about it. And so gas laws, we learned about this in grade 9, in grade 10, in grade 11 chemistry we also learned this. And so essentially gases or any particles, they diffuse from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. That's a fact. It will always happen unless there is some outside force that is forcing air from a lower pressure to a higher pressure. So the highest pressure for oxygen is found in the atmosphere, and oxygen diffuses from the air in the atmosphere into the lungs because the pressure of oxygen is much higher in the atmosphere, and so it basically just rushes into our lungs whenever we breathe in. So the largest change in pressure of oxygen is when oxygen travels from the arteries into the capillaries. Carbon dioxide follows the opposite pattern, and so the pressure of CO2 is highest in the tissues and lowest in the atmospheres. Oh, hello, ma. No, đừng mơ, mắt điên hả? Em đang làm này mà. This is my mom, everyone. Say hello.
Có thấy má không?
Thấy? Well, yeah, thấy má đây nè. Oh, má, sao má làm này vậy? Anyways, em đang làm này, em chỉ mấy đứa làm bài.
Làm bài nào?
Biology.
Trời đất ơi.
Yeah, so that's my mom.
Đi tới nhà cô Yên ăn không? Cô Yên mới về kêu mới mình lên ăn.
No, chút nữa.
Mà có đi không?
Yeah, okay, đi.
Thì bây giờ đi.
No, okay, okay, tìm Hâm đi, em Hâm đi.
Cô Yên mời giờ.
Sorry guys. Ơi tìm Hâm đi. Ồ, em đang làm này bây giờ. Em thi ngày mai mà, em đang làm mà sáng em học lại đúng không? Muốn đi chút nữa em đi má.
Chốt là bao lâu?
Một tiếng rưỡi. Anyways, so the pressure of oxygen and CO2, this is a graph, and you'll see that the pressure of oxygen is highest in the atmosphere and lowest inside the tissues, and carbon dioxide follows the opposite pattern, and it is lower in the atmosphere and higher inside our tissues. And that is because why? Our muscles actually perform cellular respiration, and they convert oxygen into carbon dioxide. We all know that. And so that is why in the tissues, lots of oxygen is being used and lots of carbon dioxide is being expelled. And that is why the concentration of carbon dioxide is so much higher inside the tissues. And so these are the components of blood. There is plasma, which is kind of like this white area right here. And there is formed elements, which is essentially our red blood cells. So these are the blood clotting cells, and these are the white blood cells, and these are the red blood cells. You don't really need to know what they're called. You're just gonna call them red blood cells on the test. So no need to worry. Oxygen transport is what breathing is basically. Breathing is more accurately the exchange of gases, but this is actually what goes on when you're inhaling. So oxygen moves from the atmosphere, where it has its highest pressure, into the alveoli, and then diffuses from the alveoli into the blood and dissolves in the plasma. And the plasma is this area right there. It then diffuses. Oxygen is not very soluble in blood, and so it's kind of traveling inside the red blood cells, and it's not gonna dissolve inside the blood cells. And hemoglobin is an oxygen-carrying molecule in red blood cells. It's made up of 4 heme proteins, iron-containing pigment, and these heme proteins basically carry 1 oxygen molecule for each heme protein. Each heme contains iron, which can bind to 1 oxygen. Yes, and so 4 heme means one hemoglobin can bond with 4 oxygen molecules. And globin basically is a protein component, so that's why it's called hemoglobin, because this is actually a protein. And so if you look at these little condom-like sacs, you'll see that the rim of the condom is actually iron, and this yellow portion here is oxygen. So a good way to remember is like when you put on a condom, you pinch the oxygen and you roll down the iron. All right. Anyways, that's that. Oxyhemoglobin is a form of hemoglobin when oxygen dissolves in the plasma. A hemoglobin forms a weak bond with the oxygen molecule to form oxyhemoglobin. And this happens when the lungs are saturated with oxygen. So blood leaving the capillaries at the alveoli are nearly saturated with oxygen. As blood enters the capillaries at the tissue throughout the body, the pressure drops, and this allows for gas exchange to occur. And so while the blood enters the capillaries, they kind of enlarge in a way, and so the pressure drops, and that makes it easier for the gases or the oxygen to diffuse into our tissues or anything, really. And so the drop in pressure causes dissociation or splitting of the oxyhemoglobin. And so the oxyhemoglobin turns into hemoglobin and oxygen, and then the oxygen diffuses into the cells. And so that is why our capillaries actually drop the pressure. And that is so the oxyhemoglobin breaks apart, and then the oxygen can then diffuse into our tissues. And so the oxygen actually goes into the hemoglobin to make oxyhemoglobin, and then the hemoglobin carries the oxygen with it. And so in this case, the hemoglobin is like a little bus for the oxygen. And so yes, this is a graph that is saying for the partial pressure of oxygen, this is the saturation of oxygen within the red blood cell. And saturation meaning the amount of oxyhemoglobin inside the red blood cell. Alright, so now we're going to look at CO2 transport. So CO2 is much more soluble in blood than oxygen is. 9% of CO2 produced by the tissues is carried in the plasma. 27% of CO2 combines with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin, and that is HbCO2. It's as simple as it is when carbon bonds with hemoglobin. And the other 64% of carbon dioxide combines with water to perform carbonic acid. So in a bit we'll explore the properties of carbonic acid and how unstable of a molecule it actually is. But for now, all you need to know is this is what happens to the oxygen inside our body. And so 64% of it combines with water and makes carbonic acid. And then the other 20% makes carbaminohemoglobin, which is basically when the CO2 bonds with the hemoglobin. It's as simple as that. And then the other 9% is the CO2 that is produced by tissues and when it is carried in the plasma. And the plasma, again, is the white portion of blood above the red blood cells. Very nice. And so, an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase increases the rate of this chemical reaction. This enzyme is found in red blood cells, and so we always have this enzyme ready to ensure that CO2 continues to diffuse into the blood, or else we would die from carbon dioxide poisoning. So, further in, the formation of carbonic acid may create a problem because acids can change the pH of blood. And we all know that we don't want acidic blood because it's exactly as bad as it sounds. So, luckily, carbon dioxide acid is very unstable and almost immediately dissociates into bicarbonate ions. And later we'll talk about how this hydrogen ion actually bonds with hemoglobin. And so in that way, hemoglobin is actually acting as a buffer to regulate the pH of our blood to keep us from going acidic. All right. So basically, as a summary, the pressure in the air is higher than the pressure inside our blood. And so the oxygen diffuses into our blood. Our red blood cells, that is what RBC stands for if you guys are confused. And then the CO2 inside our blood has a greater partial pressure than the CO2 inside of our lungs. And because of the concentration difference, the CO2 diffuses from our blood into our lungs. And then from our lungs, it goes into the air when we exhale it. And then same with oxygen. This is a really confusing chart to look at. But essentially all you have to know is the oxygen is higher from one point and it has to go to the point where it's lower. And that is a good way to remember it. Alright, so we've hit the 1 hour mark. So thank you for everyone if one of you guys actually stayed throughout the entire thing. Now we're going to be talking about the regulation of breathing movements. I'm going to turn this light on here. Can I do that? Are we good? Is it too bright? No, we're good. Okay, so regulation of breathing movements. So breathing movements are controlled by nerves from the medulla oblongata in the brain. I'm not gonna lie, I haven't actually learned this. I was not here during this day, or I came late or something. So a lot of this is actually gonna be my first time learning this. And so chemoreceptors are chemical receptors. And so the chemical receptors are basically things that detect changes in oxygen or the concentration of CO2 and will make your body compensate because of that. And so these chemoreceptors or chemical receptors are in the medulla oblongata or in the aortic arteries. And our arteries detect the status of the oxygen and our oblongata detect the CO2. And they detect information from the blood about the accumulation of carbon dioxide and acids and the need for O2. So in a lot of cases, when you're in a high altitude situation, you're going to be low on oxygen because at higher altitudes, there's actually less oxygen. And because of our chemoreceptors or chemical receptors, our body will compensate for this and we will produce more red blood cells and hemoglobin so we can more effectively diffuse oxygen. So right here is the carotid artery. It goes kind of from like our eyeballs down past our trachea. And now we're looking at the medulla oblongata, which is basically where the chemoreceptors for CO2 are. And CO2 dissolves in the blood and combines with H2O to form carbonic acid. And so this is a pretty important chemical formula to remember. There's going to be maybe some questions on this about the actual reaction to make carbonic acid. But basically, all you need to know is high CO2, the chemoreceptors are activated, and the medulla oblongata sends a message to the intercostal muscles and diaphragm and increases breathing. Because when we increase our breathing, even though we're taking in more oxygen into our muscles and we're producing more CO2, we're actually exhaling a lot of CO2 also. And that is why we breathe more when we're low on air or when we're high on air. Well, not high on air, but when we have a high heart rate, sorry. And as CO2 levels fall, chemoreceptors become inactive because they already compensated for the change. And so here are our, I don't know how to pronounce that, arteries and oxygen. And so basically when these chemoreceptors detect low levels of oxygen, and they will send messages to our medulla oblongata or our intercostal muscles and diaphragm, and it will make our breathing go higher. So it goes hand in hand. When there are lower levels of oxygen, our bodies can be forced to breathe more, and when there are high levels of CO2, our body's also going to be forced to exhale more and let go of all of that carbon dioxide. And so CO2 receptors are more sensitive to changes in blood chemistry than the O2 receptors, and the O2 receptors work more as backup. So these aortic cavities are actually not as involved in the process of activating the medulla oblongata in the same way that the medulla oblongata actually does its own job. Menace. And so as a response to exercise, ventilation can increase up to 20 times with heavy exercise, and that is also, we know, because of the medulla oblongata. 3 important factors that increase ventilation are less amounts of oxygen, higher amounts of CO2, and high amounts of hydrogen. Yes, does anyone have any questions about that? Alright, looks like we're good. And so while we're exercising, a lot of things are happening inside of our body. Our brain is receiving information from blood about the amount of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions inside of our blood. All these messages are sent to the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, and we're forced to breathe. You can stop yourself from breathing. You'll notice when you're exercising and you're running a lot, you could even hold your breath and force yourself to not breathe. But it comes to a point where you're gonna faint, and you're no longer gonna be conscious enough to actually tell yourself to stop breathing, and your body start gonna work naturally again, and your medulla oblongata right there are gonna force your body to breathe again when you're passed out. And that's why you can never really kill yourself by holding your breath, because you're gonna pass out and your reflexes are gonna force you to breathe again. And so your lungs during this time when you're exercising restore O2 and expels CO2. That's common sense. And our kidneys are removing hydrogen from the blood into urine, and that is why your piss smells kind of bad. It's a combination of the waste and also hydrogen just does not smell very nice when it mixes with our stomach fluids. So our muscles are actually increasing the demand of O2 because our muscles are working hard and they need to undergo cellular respiration in order to create the ATP for the energy. And our adrenal glands are basically the glands that release adrenaline. Adrenaline is released in response to exercise. This hormone causes breathing rate to increase. And if we all know what an adrenaline rush is when you're playing a game or when you're playing a sport and a lot of stuff is going on, you get that rush of adrenaline and you kind of naturally start breathing really heavily. So we're going to get into blood doping in a second. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Okay. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with blood doping, it's really common in sports, and it's basically when... Sorry guys, I have to take a phone call. I'm gonna go eat after this. So I'm pretty pumped. Anyways, yeah. And so in sports, blood doping is really common. You'll hear the term a lot, like, oh, this athlete is out for blood doping, and that's because basically they have injected more blood into their body, and so there's more hemoglobin inside their body to transport oxygen. And I'm assuming that's what this is going to talk about. Blood doping increases the amount of hemoglobin in the bloodstream because there's more red blood cells. And because of the more hemoglobin, more oxygen is being carried inside the blood to our lungs and our muscles, and cellular respiration is occurring at a much more rapid pace. This can improve stamina performance. It will improve stamina performance. That's a fact. Particularly in long distance events such as running or cycling, like the Tour de France and many of the Olympic sprinting events. A lot of players are accused of doping because there's just no way people can actually endure that much physical strain. This is the process of blood doping. You don't really need to know how it works, but you just need to know that it's used to increase the amount of hemoglobin inside our blood. And because there's more hemoglobin, there's more proteins to carry the oxygen into our capillaries, into our muscles. So training in altitude is what we're going to talk about next. At high altitudes, lower atmospheric pressure makes it more difficult for O2 to enter our lungs. And so it's harder to breathe up there, not only because there's less oxygen, but because there's a lower pressure. And the reason it's so easy for us to breathe is because when we're actually breathing in and inhaling, that's happening because there's a higher pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere as opposed to our lungs. So when you decrease the difference in pressure from the atmosphere to our lungs, it makes it a lot harder for us to breathe in and actually diffuse all that oxygen into our blood. And so because of this, the chemoreceptors inside our body will make our red blood cells replicate themselves. And more red blood cells are going to be produced to counter the lower oxygen saturation in the blood. And so this is actually a really good way to naturally increase the hemoglobin inside of our bloods as opposed to blood doping as seen earlier. And that is actually a legal thing. A lot of athletes actually train in high altitudes to increase their amount of hemoglobin prior to an event. Did you guys want to do a Kahoot on this? I'm not sure if a lot of you guys want to do a Kahoot. If I get at least like 3 people to comment, then maybe I'll do the Kahoot. But you know what? I don't think we need to do a Kahoot. We already did that in class. And so here's some review. Is that it? Is that it? Are we done? Wow. That is the unit, guys. That is the unit for the respiratory system. And so, in the span of 1 hour and 13 minutes, we've covered the entire biology respiratory system unit. Were there any things that you guys wanted me to review before I end the stream? Because I can definitely answer some questions. No? Are we chilling? Everyone know this stuff? Does everyone know? Yeah, the whole unit. You know what? I can do that relatively. I'm just gonna open up the all of the slides up here, and then I'm gonna go down to the key points that I feel like the most important. So let's look at the respiratory tract anatomy. The biggest thing you'll need to know is where is the picture? The picture right here. You'll see that the nasal cavity is where our nose is. We all know that nasal is linked to our nose. And there's the oral cavity. And you can breathe through either of these. It is more effective for you to breathe in with your nasal cavity because it's safer for your lungs. But you'll more effectively collect oxygen if you breathe in with your mouth. And down here is the pharynx, which is the back of your throat. And then the epiglottis, which is a cartilage trap door that prevents food from going into your lungs. The larynx is where your voice box is. And the trachea is basically the movement, is the windpipe for air to move into your bronchioles and your bronchi. Your bronchi are these two little stems right here that connect to your lungs, and inside your lungs there are these little bronchioles, and at the end of the bronchioles there are alveoli, or alveolar sac, which contains all the alveoli. Your rib cage. Ooh, yes, we'll talk about the rib cage too, because you guys might have forgotten. The intercostal muscles are basically the muscles that are like between a rib cage. So you're gonna feel them if you kind of push on the spaces in between your ribs. You kind of get kind of ticklish, and you'll feel like a muscle that can actually flex when you breathe in and out. And when you breathe in or out with these, the intercostal muscles actually contract when you breathe in. And since they contract, they allow your rib cage to open up more, and for your lungs to actually expand, because your ribs need to accommodate for the expansion of your lungs when you're breathing in. And your lungs actually expand because your diaphragm is being pulled down. And so think of it like a smiley face. When you breathe in, your body is happy, and so it's your diaphragm is gonna smile like this because it's happy. You're breathing in, and you're not gonna die because you have oxygen. And because it's pulling down like that, there's gonna be a pressure difference, and it's gonna pull your lungs to open up. And so you're basically forced to breathe. It's a misconception that when you breathe in, your lungs are actually just opening up and sucking in air, but your lungs are not doing any of that. All the work is being done by your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles. Your lungs are just hanging there, and then they inhale and they expand, or they get smaller depending on your diaphragm, if there's a vacuum or not. And so let me see if I can try to find the video that shows that. Where is the video that talks about? Right here. So this will show you the movement of air.
Did you know?
Nini wants me to go over cancer. Okay, yes, I'll talk about cancer. Alright, let's just look at this really fast so you guys can see how the breathing is. Pretty sure all of you guys remember, but let's just go over it for fun.
Diaphragm is the unsung hero of breathing. It's what makes it all happen, and that's why the diaphragm is such an important muscle.
Now, when you breathe in, the diaphragm pulls downwards. This lowers the pressure inside this chest cavity. This creates extra space, a vacuum, and air has no option but to rush in through your mouth and into your lungs to fill this space.
And then you breathe out again. Your lungs really are a bit like these balloons. They have no muscles at all. They're just like bags, really, and they don't do anything without the diaphragm.
Yes, so that's right. Your lungs don't do anything at all. They're just hanging there. And the only reason we need them is because they have the little alveolar sacs. Nini wants me to go over cancer. Yes, I can absolutely go over cancer if you wanted to. Cancer. So cancer is basically just a rapid replication of abnormal cells. And these cells like make tumors or carcinomas that kind of get in the way of our organs' functions. And so right here, like lung cancer, it's an uncontrolled and invasive growth of abnormal cells in the lungs. And these abnormal cells replicate to the point where they form random growths like tumors or carcinomas. And these reduce the surface area available for gas exchange, and they stop air from actually entering the bronchioles in some cases, because your bronchioles may have a growth inside, and that kind of obstructs the flow of oxygen into your lungs. And carcinogens are basically cancer-causing agents like smoke, any type of smoke. Yes, that's basically what cancer is, and that's the same with basically every type of cancer. Not as specific as this, where it stops the airflow, but it obstructs the function of your organs because there's such a weird growth. And that is what cancer is. And the cool fact about cancer that I talked about earlier is actually everybody has the cells capable of getting cancer. So no one is truly resistant to cancer. We all have these abnormal cells. It's just whether or not these cells choose to rapidly and invasively replicate the same way that they do when you do actually get cancer. And yeah, that's cancer. I may go over the breathing movements one more time. And so when you're actually inhaling, the diaphragm contracts, pulling downwards, and so you're happy because you're breathing in. You're happy, your diaphragm moves down like that, and that pulls and pushes air into your lungs. And while this is happening, your intercostal muscles are actually contracting and making your ribs wider and pulling them out like that. And so it can compensate for the expansion of air in your lungs. Yes, that is what's happening. And so the key points to remember are the volume of your chest increases because your intercostal muscles are contracting and the pressure in the lungs decrease, and air rushes in, obviously, because you're inhaling. And here's a little diagram. So your diaphragm obviously doesn't literally like smile like that, but it does go down and is less unhappy. And here, when you're exhaling, your diaphragm relaxes and pulls upwards, and so it's sad because you don't have any oxygen and you might pass out. And at this point, your intercostal muscles also relax, and your rib cage returns to its original state, where its lungs are unfulfilled. And when this happens, your chest volume decreases, the pressure in the lung increases, and air is forced out. And I was talking about this earlier, and it's a common misconception that when you actually exhale, the pressure decreases because you're getting rid of all this extra matter inside of your lungs and all of that. But that is not true, and pressure actually increases. And the good way to think about it is like a vacuum. When you're vacuum sealing like a steak or any frozen foods or marijuana, you know, when you're vacuum sealing it, you're actually increasing the pressure inside of the bag, and you're squeezing everything that's inside of the bag because the pressure is so high. But when you're inhaling, there's actually a lower pressure because there's more things can actually move more freely in that case when you breathe in. And that right here is the movement of air and what's going on with your ribs and your lungs and your diaphragm while you're breathing in. Breathing disorders, we really don't need to cover that. Gas exchange. You guys do have to remember that things move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So it's really easy. Like, you don't have to look at a chart and memorize what's going on. Just break it into steps. When you're breathing in, the concentration of the atmosphere is so much higher than the concentration of air inside your lungs. And so the air goes straight into your lungs and you can actually breathe. And then now the concentration of air inside your lungs is so high compared to the concentration of air inside your capillaries. And so the oxygen moves from the alveoli into your capillaries because of that difference in pressure. And then now there's such a high concentration of blood inside of your blood and capillaries compared to the amount of oxygen inside of your muscle tissues that they diffuse into your muscle tissues. And it's the exact opposite way around CO2. And just remember that it's always alternating, right? There's always an area of high concentration going down to an area of low concentration. Always. Unless it's CO2, but even CO2, like, it's going from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Like, always. You'll never see a movement of low concentration to high concentration. So whenever you're writing anything, just remember, like, when you're writing, like, oxygen is moving from your capillaries into your muscle tissues, then you know that right away that the concentration of oxygen inside your capillaries are higher than your tissue because it's going from your capillary into your tissue. That's about it for the reason of gas exchange. Did you guys want to go over like oxyhemoglobin and carbonic acid and all of that stuff, or did you think it was good? Do you guys know all of your like carbonic acid, your carbaminohemoglobin, and all that stuff? Yeah, all right. I never knew you were in bio, Nini, but that's pretty cool that you know this stuff. I'll stream for the next 8 minutes. So for the next 8 minutes, I'll just cover oxyhemoglobin and carbonic acid and all that stuff. All right, so let's look over hemoglobin. So oxyhemoglobin is just HbO2, and it happens when oxygen is bonding with the hemoglobin inside of your red blood cells. So when oxygen dissolves in plasma, and plasma is actually this white stuff above of your red blood cells, oxygen dissolves into that plasma there, and it bonds with the hemoglobin. And so oxygen is actually not really soluble with blood, and so this bond is pretty weak with the hemoglobin, and you'll see later that it actually breaks apart pretty easily and diffuses into our tissues. And so in each hemoglobin molecule, is there a picture of hemoglobin somewhere here? Yes. So in each hemoglobin molecule, there's actually 4 of these little hemes. And these are protein, basically. The hemoglobin entirely is a protein, but these hemes are basically little discs of iron that attract the O2 or oxygen. And so these little discs attract the oxygen and bond with the oxygen. And the reason they bond with this oxygen is because this hemoglobin needs to travel into our blood, and then the oxygen can finally hop off with the hemoglobin bus and diffuse into our tissues. And that is the whole purpose of hemoglobin, is to transport oxygen around our body into the tissues of our blood. That is what it's for. And for every molecule of hemoglobin, there's 4 hemes, and these 4 hemes can attach to 1 oxygen molecule each. And you'll notice you start breathing heavier, as we talked about regulation of breathing. When our body senses that there is a lower concentration of oxygen, one of the ways we'll compensate is to breathe harder and take in more oxygen. Before long-term occasions, our body will actually adapt, and we will produce more red blood cells and more hemoglobin to carry more oxygen throughout our bodies. So that was pretty cool. Yes. So as blood enters the capillaries at the tissues throughout the body, the pressure drops. And this pressure drops because when the pressure drops, the bond between hemoglobin and oxygen break apart, and the oxygen finally splits off and diffuses into the tissues of our muscles. And here is the little graph for the partial pressure of oxygen and the amount of oxygen inside the red blood cell. And you'll see that the higher the pressure of oxygen is inside of our hemoglobin, then there's a higher saturation. All right. Yes, I suppose I'll go over the carbonic acid if we've got enough time for that. All right, so CO2 is much more soluble in blood than O2. You don't really need to remember much of these numbers, but just remember that there is basically 3 spots that CO2 can actually go through. Oh. Yeah, I figured that Nini's not in bio. Anyways, CO2 is way more soluble in blood than oxygen is. And so 9% of the carbon dioxide produced by the tissues is carried inside the plasma in our red blood cells. 27% of the carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin. And you'll see what happens to the carbaminohemoglobin later on. You don't really have to worry about it now at this point. And the other 64% of carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid. And so you'll know that acid sounds like a pretty deadly thing to have flowing inside of your blood vessels, and that's because it is, and it's very dangerous for our blood to become too acidic, obviously, because you don't want to eat away at our blood vessels, and our heart may not process it properly, and all that bad stuff that might happen. And so what our body does is actually it breaks apart the carbonic acid molecules. They break apart because it is a very unstable molecule, luckily, and so it breaks apart into bicarbonate ions, and then the hydrogen ions that actually make everything acidic are taken in by the hemoglobin up here. The hemoglobin actually take in the hydrogen ion, and they work as a buffer to regulate the pH levels of our blood. And so the hemoglobin is actually the lifesaver when it comes to the regulation of pH inside of our blood. And that is what happens to carbonic acid. Not much really, because the moment carbonic acid is formed, when it combines with water, it essentially disassociates right away to bicarbonate ions, and then the hemoglobin takes the hydrogen ions to prevent our blood from becoming acidic. And yeah, I know, Nini, this is really good knowledge. I'm really glad that you're willing to come here and learn, even though you're wasting your time. Yes, I will pull out a picture on here. It may actually be on here. Is this it? Oh, balls. It's not. Okay. I will show you a picture of the pressures of oxygen inside of our body. When I can find the pictures. When I can find the pictures. Huzzah! Okay. So, if you look at this right here. Sorry, I'm just gonna. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. Okay. So, you can see it better here. Focus. Focus. Okay. So, right here is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere as it travels down into the alveoli. Sorry, this is the concentration of CO2 in the alveoli as it travels out into the atmosphere as it's being expelled because we are exhaling. And the concentration of CO2 in our alveoli is much higher than the concentration of CO2 inside the atmosphere. And because of that, the CO2 naturally moves out of our alveoli into our atmosphere. And it's naturally inclined to do so. Even though our muscles and several chemicals are helping the CO2 move out, this is actually a result of the difference in pressure. And it's same for the oxygen over here. You'll see that there's a higher pressure of oxygen. I'll pull up the graph. Actually, is there the graph here? Where is the graph? Okay, the graph is right here. So you pull out the graph here, and you can see that there's actually a really high concentration of oxygen inside the atmosphere and a really low concentration of oxygen inside the tissues. And it's the other way around. And so if you actually look at this picture here, this side right here would be completely opposite to this side right here. And you just got to remember that things are always moving from an area of high pressure down to an area of low pressure. And here it's going from an area of high pressure relative to the pressure here, right? And so it's high to low, and then high to low. High to low, and then high to low, and then high to low, and then high to low down here, right? And it's always going from pressure of high to low. And you may be confused. You might say, Brandon, why is there Winnie Pooh in the background? But that's not really important. But you might say, hey, why is the concentration of oxygen so high in this one portion here, but then it's so low here? But then in a couple of seconds, this area is high even though you just said it was low. And that's because it is low, but it's low relative to the pressure of the atmosphere. And so it's all about relativity when you're talking about the partial pressures here, right? It doesn't really matter how high of a pressure something is, how much kP it is. What matters is the pressure relative to where the gas is moving, right? So don't pay too much attention to, it's really high in the atmosphere here, right? You have to look at how it's really high in relativity to the trachea, in relativity to the alveoli, compared to the arteries, compared to the veins, right? Because it's not high going to low. It's high going to something that is less than high, right? And that is basically the exchange of gases. And so we've gone over everything up here. We've gone through all the slides. But before I for sure end the stream, did any of you guys have questions or anything you wanted to ask before I unplug it? I unplug the stream. We good? Yeah. All right. Sweet. thank you so much for coming, taking in all of this knowledge. Yeah. Make sure to come here. I can actually do reviews for any units, even classes that I am not in. I will gladly do review on those units. I'll take the time out to learn those units and teach those. Yeah, I'm pretty open. So if you guys ever want a review for any of your subjects, just come text me, let me know, or you can drop in a comment right now, and I'll just start learning it, and I'll do a review for it whenever you have a unit test coming up. I'm pretty ready for everything. I'll be right back. Hold on. This is Max. Hello. Okay. But yeah, guys, I will gladly review any unit that you guys wanted to do, any wanted me to learn. Thank you so much for coming again. Really appreciate your support. Thank you so much for the donations. I appreciate it. Man's gotta eat. It's really how it is. Yeah. This is bye. This is goodbye, guys. Love you guys so much. Love you guys so much. I'm so glad I'm so sad I have to go.